Founded in 2014, Data and Society is a nonprofit that studies the implications of data and automation, producing original evidence-based empirical research about emerging tech. Janet Haven is the organization's executive director. She's also spent more than a decade with the Open Society Foundations overseeing funding and grants to civil society, human rights, and governance and accountability through technology. She's joining us today to talk about citizenship in an era of algorithmic decision-making. Please welcome to the Forward 50 stage, Data and Society's Executive Director, Janet Haven. Hi, Janet.
Hey, Alistair. How are you?
Well, thanks. It's good to see you.
Great to see you too. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. I always love hearing the stuff you're working on these days. You have a few thoughts on citizenship for us.
I do. Well, I'm really talking about algorithms in the state and the rights and wrongs in an era of algorithmic decision making. So I do want to thank everyone for joining me today. And again, Alistair and Rebecca for inviting me to talk. For those in the audience, I'm guessing that you're here because you're thinking about the guardrails around algorithmic decision-making systems. And I am too. That's what I'm talking about. We have a lot of algorithmic systems out in the world. What we don't have yet is robust approaches to governing them. So why has algorithmic accountability been so hard to get to? And what are the pathways to just governance of algorithmic systems? So one way to answer that is to look to a public call from the White House's Office of Science and Technology Policy, which was published a few weeks back in Wired magazine. It was entitled, "Americans Need a Bill of Rights for an AI-Powered World." And so what the authors were arguing in this piece is a point that I think is increasingly accepted. Algorithmic systems have benefits for society, there's no doubt. They also are hurting people. And they're disproportionately hurting people who have been historically excluded and who continue to be the most vulnerable in our societies. And what OSTP is acknowledging here is that governments are letting us down because of the lack of regulation in these systems. So needless to say, I'm excited that OSTP is joining the European Parliament and other regulatory bodies, also those in Canada, in putting algorithmic governance front and center. But that said, as the authors make clear in this piece, this problem isn't straightforward to solve. The harms and the benefits of algorithms are complex and they're interrelated. And so what we really need to do is to get creative about governance. We need to be real about our current limitations in knowing how to govern these systems. And we also need to come up with new approaches to accountability. And we need to do it now. The pressure to act is real. These challenges are urgent. In a recent talk, Deb Raji, who is a well-known algorithmic accountability scholar and activist, is making the case that AI harms don't only limit opportunity and target the most vulnerable, they have immediate consequences for real people. They lead to health consequences when they're used to allocate public benefits. They can lead to educational consequences when they're used to allocate university access. And they can even lead to loss of freedom when used in the criminal justice system. So what Raji's arguing here is that creating robust accountability is urgent because people are experiencing harms from algorithmic systems now in real and life-changing ways. And right now, there are not very many avenues for redress. That said, accountability is a hard problem. If it were easy or straightforward, earlier attempts to regulate would have been successful. We've all seen countless hearings inviting tech CEOs to testify about the steps their companies are taking to prevent harms, followed by bills that get introduced but don't move forward, aren't put up for a vote. Many governments around the world are starting to move regulation forward only now. So why has this been so difficult? So first, this isn't only about regulating the private sector. The state itself increasingly relies on algorithmic decision making to govern. And so when we think about how the state is engaging on AI and algorithmic decision-making systems, it's critical that we understand governments as both regulators of these systems and also as the users, designers, purchasers, deployers of sometimes opaque technologies. And automated data centric technologies shape key state functions: criminal justice, education, welfare, labor, housing, even the basic functions of democracy, such as elections and apportionment. A second reason this is hard is, to put it bluntly, we've relied for a long time on the idea that the tech can fix the tech, but it can't. We can't solve for social failures of technical systems solely by adding more technology. These are socio-technical challenges. And to address them, we need to understand the impacts of these systems in a range of social contexts through the expertise of lived experience. A third reason that meaningful accountability is hard is that we simply don't yet have all of the regulatory tools and methods that we need to govern, even though we're seeing these systems used already in a range of high stakes settings. But one thing we do know, and that regulatory attempts in the US and the EU and other places are making clear, is that the status quo just isn't an option. We have to be thinking expansively and creatively about when existing regulatory tools can be used to mitigate algorithmic harms. But there are instances when those existing tools aren't going to be effective. And then we need to think about novel strategies. And in some cases, that can mean, for instance, banning very high risk technologies, like some of those involving biometrics. We're starting to see that kind of ban with the police use of facial recognition technology in a number of municipalities and recently in a call across the EU. So one final reason that governance of these systems is tough is that we need it to be anticipatory rather than reactive. So governance that happens after the technology is deployed is mitigating these already baked in negative effects. What we need are systems of accountability that anticipate the impact of algorithmic systems rather than attempting to clean up the wreckage in their wake. So, the European Parliament's Artificial Intelligence Act, which is right now moving its way through committee in Brussels, is a major attempt and one of the first major attempts to do that kind of anticipatory work. So, one thing I do want to say clearly, I think that this is a role for government. Leaving the private sector to govern algorithmic systems alone through self regulation, company principles, and other responsible AI initiatives isn't going to be a strategy for long term public trust in automation and AI. The other reason for that is the public sector algorithms are increasingly under scrutiny. The ways in which governments, the ways in which states choose to use these systems themselves will shape the trust and doubt in public and democratic institutions in the future. So, what does an algorithmic state look like on the ground? I'd like to talk through a couple of examples that look at how real people are experiencing public sector algorithms and the data structures, data infrastructures being built to support them. Last year, in the midst of the pandemic, in-person university entrance testing was canceled in the United Kingdom. Instead, the UK government used an algorithm to assign scores to students for university qualifying exams. But the scores that the UK's algorithm assigned were disproportionately lower for students from schools with lower income populations and higher numbers of Black and Brown students. And students and parents were outraged, of course. For a young person, what could be more consequential than the score that determines their opportunity for higher education and lifelong achievement? The algorithm's designers had used factors like past overall student performance at a particular school or the teacher's estimation of grades. But it's well documented that bias is built into educational grading. Using a biased data set will only amplify that unfairness. And indeed, we've seen stories of individual impact and harm that have emerged in the ensuing year. One student, Josiah Elliston Burrell, was profiled in a Guardian article by Tom Lamont earlier this year. Josiah was forced to fight against the conclusions of an opaque algorithm that excluded him from a seat at University College London. He prevailed, but only after a complex and fraught struggle to claim the scores that reflected his actual work. So, in response to this uproar, the UK government canceled the scores. They also apologized for using an algorithm to make decisions about something so fundamental to life opportunities. The head of the responsible government office ended up resigning. And so our response to that whole situation could be, well, that's accountability. That's what we're looking for. People protested, their voices were amplified, outrage grew, and the government changed course. But is that the accountability we're looking for? I don't think so. Because what hasn't happened is a wider reckoning about the use of algorithms in the public sector. Pulling back from the use of this algorithm elides the real debate we need to be having. In what context should we be using algorithmic systems? Just because we can doesn't mean that we should. Another example of the state's drive to automate is in publicly funded care work. So, this is a story about the rising imperative to collect data at high social cost to support an algorithmic state. In 2016, the US Congress passed the 21st Century Cures Act. The act was intended to modernize medical product development, presumably with the objective of improving care. But the act included a curious addition, a federal provision requiring all Medicaid funded home health care services to use electronic visit verification systems known as EVV. So, for those who are not from the US, Medicaid is the US's national health insurance program for low income adults, children, elderly, people with disabilities. In other words, these are the groups who are already experiencing economic and social vulnerability. So, what the EVV system means is that if you are a care worker who's paid by Medicaid to provide multiple home care services to a client, you're now required in many states to check in multiple times for each service in every visit to your client on an app. It's something like Foursquare for at home healthcare, which sounds somewhat benign, except that the design goals of these systems are to identify and root out alleged, and I'm quoting, fraud, waste, and abuse through digital surveillance of workers and their clients. Well, that's a very different design goal than increasing the quality or ease of care for our society's most vulnerable members. There's also little evidence that fraud in personal home care services is widespread, according to research. So, so what problem are we solving for here? Why the drive to automate care? My colleagues at Data and Society's Labor Futures program have been studying the social effects of EVV systems on both care workers and their clients for the past 2 years. And what our team found is that EVV systems erode the quality of care. As with the UK scoring system, the design failed to account for the social implications of EVV. According to research findings, the experience of using the EVV system is one of expansive surveillance and criminalization of low wage workers and public benefits recipients. Caregivers interviewed for the research reported that they had to take these extraordinary steps to meet the requirements of the check in system, steps that interfered with their ability to care for their clients. The focus becomes managing the app rather than providing care. Some caregivers had to leave their clients in order to find reliable internet connections. Some of the systems used geofencing, meaning that caregivers aren't able to take their clients out of a designated care area, which limited life activities, shopping, visiting with friends, walks in the park, but they weren't able to go. So there's two key takeaways from this story that I want you to hear. One, the design values of public sector systems matter. The EVV systems my colleagues studied aren't designed to increase the quality of care for Medicaid recipients. Why not? Second, when we think about algorithms in the state, we need to understand not just the algorithm, the model, but the data demanding infrastructures that are being built to support it. And we need to ask ourselves whether those are necessary. Again, just because we can doesn't mean that we should. So it's clear that we need new approaches to governing data centric technologies and AI. So, what does meaningful accountability look like if an algorithmic system causes harm? So, before we jump into solutions, and I have a couple to talk about, I want to talk for a moment about magic. Magical thinking can shape what we expect of algorithmic systems in both the public and the private sectors. We often look to technology to solve long standing, complex social issues through objectivity. But the technology often can't do what we're asking it to do. It can't be neutral, it can't be unbiased, it can't be objective, and it can't make judgments that aren't based on the past. As a predictive technology, it's fundamentally informed by what's happened before, and crucially, by what's happened before that was captured in a data set. So, how do we counter magical thinking? One way is through understanding the social impacts of an algorithmic system, the harms and the benefits. There's an emerging field of algorithmic audits and other tools designed to address those questions. And that's really exciting to see taking shape. So let me dig a little bit deeper into what these new approaches to governance of algorithmic systems look like. One really promising approach that scholars and policymakers are converging around is algorithmic impact assessments. These are modeled on impact assessments in other fields like finance or environmental studies. And I have high hopes for AIAs if they're designed in the public interest. So, what's complicating is that they're not an out of the box accountability solution. I want to highlight three sources of complexity quickly, which all come down to questions of power. So, first, impact. What constitutes an impact of an algorithmic system isn't obvious or clearly bounded. Is it defined by the designer of the system or by the members of the public who will experience the impact? Second, assuming public participation is key, who is the public and what does meaningful public involvement look like? And finally, naming an impact isn't the same as elevating benefits and protecting against harms. The algorithmic impact assessments have to include pathways to remedy enforcement and sanctions when harms do occur to be more than accountability theater. And that's a major challenge for OSTP's AI Bill of Rights and other emerging AI governance mechanisms, building a full and transparent process that ensures the just outcomes we all deserve. So I want to leave you today with these three questions that we need to know how to answer in the future to ensure justice in an algorithmic era. Can the system do what it purports to do? Are the impacts of the system understood? And what is the recourse if a person is harmed by the decisions rendered by an algorithm? We need to be able to answer these questions about algorithmic systems our governments are using. The rise of an algorithmic state requires it. And for that to happen, we need to support leadership that sees the urgency of these issues and requires the deep public engagement with the communities who are most impacted by these systems. Thank you.